Yeah, so this is the first time I've given a talk at the Daiwa Foundation, but having been here now 10 years exactly, it seems like the moment. So actually the genesis of this talk is that Nana Ota, who's our head of events, whom I'm sure many of you know well, she called me one Monday and said she'd had a brilliant idea for a talk over the weekend, and it was that I should give a talk about the Daiwa Foundation. And I didn't think this sounded all that interesting, to be honest. And I consulted with a couple of my colleagues, and they didn't think it sounded very interesting either. So I suggested that maybe we should talk about something else. So if you do want to talk about the Daiwa Foundation at some point, we can do it. But the groundswell of opinion internally is that wouldn't be tremendously exciting. So I'm going to talk about two Brits in Japan, both literary figures, Edmund Blunden and William Plomer. His name isn't on the screen, but it will be in a minute. Let's put him on the screen. So actually his name was originally pronounced Plomer, as it looks, but for some reason he decided he wanted it to be pronounced Plumer, so he insisted on it being pronounced Plumer for the rest of his life. And I suppose these two people are both examples of something that I've come across quite a lot since I started my previous job at the British Council, which is people who got involved with Japan historically and whose stories are really, I hope you'll find, quite fascinating. Presumably it was this sort of story that got the late Seihu Kotatsu to publish that series of books, Japan Biographical Portraits, and there are some really interesting ones in there as well. Anyway, these two literary figures, their stories are somewhat entwined. I guess a lot of people probably haven't heard of either of them. So Edmund Blunden was primarily a poet. He was actually nominated 6 times for the Nobel Prize in Literature, although of course he didn't win it. I think the reason why his poetry isn't that much remembered today is that it was a bit old-fashioned. He loved the English countryside, and a lot of his poetry is about the countryside. But these were the days when people like T.S. Eliot were coming to the fore, and in that sense I think his poetry is quite old-fashioned. Probably these days he's better remembered for a prose work that he wrote called Undertones of War, which was a kind of memoir of his experiences fighting in the First World War. So that's Blunden. Plumer burst onto the literary scene in 1925 with the publication of a novel called Turbowolf. And he published various other prose and poetry works through his life. But actually he's probably best remembered not for his own books at all. And I'll come on to explain what he is remembered for. So the Japan connection is that both of them spent some time in Japan in the 1920s, and they knew each other there. In fact, for a while they lived in the same building. Blunden went back to Japan a second time to live there for a short time after the Second World War. But neither of them really spent a long time in Japan. But I think in both cases their time in Japan had a big impact on them, and they in turn had quite a big influence when they came back to the UK. So let's start with Blunden. He was the older of the two. He was born in 1896, while Plumer was born in 1903. Blunden's parents were the joint head teachers of the village school in Yelding. I don't even know how you pronounce it, Yelding, which is a village in Kent. And actually Blunden claimed in a poem written in the 1930s called Looking Eastward that he was pointed in the direction of Japan when he was still in Yelding. The poem has 2 lines which go, "Down our street when I was a boy, I met with a friendly man who took me to the stone-cross steps and said to me, 'See Japan.'" Some of his poetry does sound a little bit like doggerel, particularly in Japan. He used to write poems at the drop of a hat for various, on request for various occasions, just the way that haiku poets used to. But perhaps one result is that some of the poems seem to me not to be all that good. Anyway, this one refers to the stone-cross steps in Yelding, and I'm slightly puzzled by this because I assume that these are the stone-cross steps in Yelding. There's a stone cross with steps leading up to it, but this is actually a war memorial for the First World War. So it wasn't put there until, well, it was unveiled in 1920, by which time Blunden would have been 24, so it's not quite the sort of little boy that you imagine. And I wonder if this is slightly conflating what really happened. Now, Blunden actually moved to Japan for his first time there in 1924. So maybe the conversation about See Japan was actually when he was discussing with somebody should he take up this job offer that he'd received to go to Japan, rather than happening when he was a little boy. Anyway, Blunden's background was fairly typical kind of upper middle class. So his parents were both school teachers. He was educated at Christ's Hospital. He's the one in the middle there wearing the rather distinctive Christ's Hospital uniform. He was the, I think he was, yes, the senior Grecian, so I think he was a classicist when he was at Christ's Hospital. And later he went on to Queen's College, Oxford. But World War I broke out when Blunden was 18, so he postponed his studies at Oxford to go and fight, which he actually did with some distinction. He got the Military Cross in 1917 for conspicuous gallantry in action. In 1918, when we were still fighting the war, he was actually sent to train soldiers in a training camp back in the UK, and during that period he met and married a girl called Mary Danes, who was actually a barmaid in a hotel in Newmarket near where he was working. Well, she was obviously an attractive barmaid, but I think another factor is that Blunden, after the horrors of the First World War, probably had dreams of a kind of nice Thomas Hardy style country existence. This girl he married, Mary Danes, her father was the local blacksmith in a village outside Newmarket, and I think she was the 9th of 11 children, very extended family. So I can sort of imagine Blunden looking at this quiet rural life where he would do his literature after the war. In 1919 he left the army and went to Oxford to take up the scholarship that he had won when he was at school. But actually he was rather restless at Oxford, as I imagine maybe many people were coming back from the war. He dropped out after a year or so and decided to go directly into his career as a poet. And his poetry was well received. He won the Hawthornden Prize in 1922 for a volume of poetry called The Shepherd, which I think gives you a hint of the kind of thing he was focusing on. But then, as now, there wasn't a lot of money in poetry, so he did editing work and reviewing and that kind of thing. He also played an important role in rescuing the pastoral poet John Clare from obscurity. Again, this hints at Blunden's interest in the English countryside. But he needed more money. He was married. His wife actually had 3 children by 1924, although the first of them died in infancy. So he accepted this job in 1924 as Professor of Literature at the University of Tokyo. Now, these posts in Japan in those days for foreigners were pretty lucrative. Some of you may know about the system that was introduced in the Meiji period to bring in foreign experts to advise Japan. They were known as Oyatoi Gaikokujin, and were paid a lot more than the local Japanese professors. So Blunden, who had been earning £250 a year for his work as an editor at the Athenaeum literary magazine, his salary went from £250 to £900 a year at Tokyo University. So that was clearly one of the attractions. His wife, however, was not so keen to move to Tokyo. Blunden wrote to a friend that she can't grow enthusiastic over foreign parts. She fears the earthquakes and the lingo. Of course, the Great Kanto earthquake struck the Tokyo area in 1923, the year just before Blunden went there. And actually much of Tokyo was in ruins, and Tokyo University itself was largely in ruins. This I found on the internet, but that's supposed to be a photograph of a gate of Tokyo University, I suppose. So it was undergoing rebuilding when Blunden was teaching there, and a lot of his classes had to be taught in temporary premises. He refers to the construction work also in one of his poems. It goes, "Like men of fire in painful night, the eastern builders thud their iron round." So Mary, his wife, wasn't too keen, and she had, as I say, two small children. This is a little later, but that's a rather grotty photograph of Mary with their two children. Now, I can't help feeling that for a young man of 28 to leave his wife for several years to go and work on the other side of the world was probably a recipe for marital disaster. Obviously, the only way they would communicate would be via letters which went by ship. And it did prove to be a marital disaster, as I will come on to. But in some ways, the fact that he went on his own, tanshin funin, as you would say in Japanese, was the making of Blunden when he was in Japan. His predecessor, also a foreigner teaching English literature at Tokyo University, had lived in the Imperial Hotel, rather grandly, and had gone by car every day to Tokyo University with his wife accompanying him. But Blunden lived in more modest accommodation. He started off actually renting a house in the sort of back garden of one of the other professors, a Japanese professor at Tokyo University. We actually know exactly where this house was because obviously Blunden's friends were a little bit bemused by the fact that he had gone to Tokyo. And they also found the Japanese system of addresses quite difficult. So one of Blunden's friends wrote a little poem to help them with the address. And the poem goes, "Blunden does his lyric tricks down at number 26, Kitayamabushi-cho, Ushigome, Tokyo." So that was the address. It's quite near actually where I used to work at the British Council, near Kagurazaka, or Iidabashi Station. Well, anyway, subsequently, Blunden moved to the Kikufuji Hotel, which was only about 10 minutes' walk from the campus of Tokyo University at Hongo. And this hotel actually had literary associations. Actually, quite a few of the hotels in that part of Tokyo do. But the novelist Junichiro Tanizaki, for instance, lived in this hotel for a period of time. Sadly, it was destroyed by firebombing in the big firebombing raid which happened in March 1945, so it's no longer there. But there's a sort of a stone marking where it used to be. Anyway, at this hotel, Blunden rather flourished. He was a generous man and a conscientious teacher, and he spent most of his evenings, it seems, drinking and discussing literature with his students. And his students found his teaching rather inspiring. And as they got to know him very well, many of them became devoted fans of Blunden. So, for instance, the novelist Tomoji Abe said of Blunden, "He was Japan's best friend. He brings out the best in us." And of course, this being Tokyo University, many of Blunden's students subsequently went on to become leading figures, both in the world of academia and in the world of literature. So he was extremely influential. It was around this time that he met William Plomer, the other person this talk is about. So let me backtrack a little bit and introduce Plumer to you. He was British, but he'd been brought up largely in South Africa. His parents had decided to seek their fortunes in the colonies, and after various experiences, they'd ended up running a kind of general trading store in a Zulu area of South Africa. And I have managed to find this grainy picture of the store. This is when they first arrived there. It was a bit wild, I think. Plumer was thrown into daily contact with the natives, who were largely Zulu in that area. And it seems that the previous owners of this store, who were also white, had made a bit of a habit of kind of cheating the locals. And therefore the store had not done terribly well because people didn't trust it. But it seems that Plumer's parents were much more decent people. They treated the locals well and became good friends with many of them, and the store flourished. So this was where Plumer was when he published his first novel, Turbowolf, which I mentioned earlier. This came out in 1925. And it drew very heavily on Plumer's own experiences. The main character, Turbowolf, is a trader who opens a general store in Zululand and befriends many of the local black Africans. He has more difficulty, as his parents indeed did, getting on with the bigoted local white people. Another thing is that Plumer, who was gay, although I think he hadn't quite made his mind up at this stage, he was very impressed by the physiques of the local Zulus. And there's an interesting passage in his autobiography. He writes, "Well-developed young girls would long remain unself-consciously chatting, with their prominent upper charms almost under one's nose. Or they would playfully divert themselves, and each other, by removing their scanty coverings in order to reflect their nether charms in a pie glass just inside the door. The young bucks, descendants of Chaka's braves, ornamented with a few beads and little else, and moving with superb grace, erectness, and ease, were often models of bodily perfection." So you get the general idea. Anyway, Turbowolf featured an interracial love affair between the title character, who was white, and a black woman. And I believe, I haven't actually read the book, but I believe they actually get married. Well, interracial marriages were not actually illegal in South Africa at that time. They became illegal just after the war, the Second World War. But as you can imagine, they were pretty much frowned upon by the white establishment. So the book caused a bit of a scandal. But it also made a positive impression on many people, including the young Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond books. He read Turbowolf when he was still a schoolboy at Eton, and he actually sent Plumer a fan letter. And this was the beginning of a lifelong friendship, about which I'll talk a bit more later. So after the success, or success to scandal as it were, of this book, Plumer founded a magazine which was called Voorslag. That's Afrikaans. It means whiplash. And it attacked the racism and imperialism of white South African society. But this obviously wasn't terribly popular with the other whites in South Africa. He wasn't. The magazine didn't do terribly well. I think only 3 issues appeared. Now you probably can't see because it's too small on this slide. But the third item in this edition is actually by Lawrence van der Post, whom I think many of you will have heard of. So he was later to become famous as the author of the 2 books that were eventually turned into the film Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, about his experiences in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in the Second World War. And he was also famously a mentor to Prince Charles. Van der Post was one of the people that was working with Plumer on this rather radical magazine in South Africa. And he's very much linked with the story of how Plumer ended up in Japan. There are actually slightly different versions of this story, so I'm not completely sure of the truth. But broadly speaking, it seems that Plumer was sitting in a cafe in Durban in 1926 when a Japanese man walked in. And the cafe owner told him to get out, as the cafe was for whites only. And Lawrence van der Post, who also, well, obviously he was with Plumer, quite opposed to the kind of racist system in South Africa, he remonstrated with the cafe owner and persuaded her to allow the Japanese man to stay in the cafe. The man was called Mr. Mori, and he was actually the captain of a ship that was trading between Durban and Japan. And of course, he was grateful for the intervention. But this particular incident in Durban, I think, had a bearing on a larger matter which was a concern in Japan at the time. I have got a slide, by the way, of Lawrence van der Post here, which I'd forgotten to show you. So that's Lawrence van der Post at the right. Sezala is the place where they actually set up house together in South Africa to produce this magazine. And the other main character in it was Roy Campbell. I think Mary Campbell is his wife there. Anyway, so Van der Post was in this cafe and persuaded them to let the sea captain Mori in. But the bigger issue here was that Japan, as many of you will know, had been fighting to be treated as an equal by Western nations, really ever since the so-called unequal treaties were imposed on it in the late 1850s. And this was still going on. After the First World War ended, the Japanese tried very hard to get a racial equality clause inserted into the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. But they were actually not successful in this. The Australians in particular fought against it, but they were backed by the British and the Americans, who were running the peace conference, really. And so the racial equality clause didn't get through. So Japan was still fighting to be treated equally, particularly in countries like South Africa, of course, where race was a particularly big issue. Captain Mori, and I've got a photograph of him too, he worked for the shipping company Osaka Shosen, and he seems to have been a very interesting character, but he decided pretty much of his own bat to invite Lawrence van der Post on a 2-week holiday in Japan. He would come back on the ship, and then Mori would show him around for 2 weeks and show him what a wonderful country Japan was. And I think Mori's idea was that an up-and-coming writer who was anti-racist would be a sort of useful ally for the Japanese in trying to get rid of this racist treatment to which they objected. So van der Post persuaded Mori to invite his friend Plumer as well. And if anything, Plumer was an even bigger catch than van der Post, because he'd just written this anti-racist novel which had caused quite a stir. Furthermore, Plumer was probably looking to get out of South Africa, where he'd slightly burnt his boats, I think. So they both went. They both got to know Captain Mori pretty well on the ship, and he seems to have been a kind of archetypal samurai type. He had a great love for classical Japanese poetry and music, and would chant the Japanese classics of an evening and play the shakuhachi and so on. But he also had rather a martial side, and quite an aggressive patriotism and belief in the superiority of the Japanese. So I suppose that was racism of a different type. So he made quite an impression on both of these two young authors. So they did their trip of Japan. Van der Post went home, but Plumer had nothing particular to do and decided to stay. And he had a letter of introduction to Blunden. Of course, he needed a job. He only had enough money to last for about 2 or 3 weeks in Japan. So he got in touch with Blunden, and Blunden found him a job, initially at a language school. And he also moved Plumer into the hotel, the Kikufuji Hotel, where Blunden himself was staying. But Plumer couldn't afford to stay there for very long, so he moved out quite quickly. Eventually the job was upgraded from the language school, and Plumer started working as a teacher at the Tokyo High School, which was closely linked to Tokyo University. In fact, it was absorbed into Tokyo University in, I think, the 1940s. Now, somebody here may know better than me, but my belief is that high schools in those days went up to a slightly higher age than they do now. But I haven't quite got to the bottom of that. Anyway, so that's where Plumer was working, as introduced by Blunden. And he moved out, he first of all lived in Kaminerima, which was actually more of a kind of farming village on the outskirts of Tokyo to start with. And then later on he moved to Higashi Nakano, a little bit further in. So there are the two of them in Japan. Now, in 1925, I want to go back to Blunden here, but I mentioned that his marriage, seems to me, was unlikely to survive this experiment. But in 1925, he'd been in Japan for a little over a year. Blunden fell in love with a Japanese woman who was called Aki Hayashi. She was a junior high school teacher in Nagoya, and they met when he was teaching on a summer school in Karuizawa, which is up in the mountains. It's a kind of resort area, especially popular for avoiding summer heat. So by September 1925, it was fairly clear that their relationship was a sexual one, judging from the letters between them. And by early 1926, Hayashi actually gave up her teaching job in Nagoya and moved in with Blunden in Tokyo, where I think she was actually also helping him with his literary work. Now, to be fair to Blunden, the letters from his wife had rather dried up during the summer and autumn of 1925, and it seems that she had also shacked up with somebody else back in the UK. So things weren't going well on the marriage side. Interestingly, so Aki Hayashi was about, I think she was 7 years older than Blunden, and this photograph suggests to me that she was not particularly prepossessing. But anyway, there was a great love affair between the two. I won't go into a lot of detail about Aki Hayashi, but it's a poignant and rather sad story. And if you're interested in it, a Japanese lady called Sumie Okada has published a book about it, which is based on the letters of Blunden to this lady, which were found among her possessions when she died. So anyway, while Blunden was in Tokyo, Hayashi clearly was in a slightly vulnerable position. He wasn't going to stay in Japan forever. So she persuaded him to promise her that he would take her back to the UK as his literary secretary when he eventually returned. Obviously, he couldn't promise to marry her because he was married already, but she tried to get some sort of commitment on that side as well. And also among her papers was found this rather odd statement signed by Blunden in which he didn't promise to marry her, but he said that if he were ever to marry a second time, he would, in all probability, marry Aki. That was the best I think she could get out of him. And in fact, when Blunden returned to the UK in 1927, he did take her back. It seems quite likely that their sexual relationship was already over by that point, and certainly Blunden, I think, had decided he was going to go back to his wife, so he'd better keep her at arm's length as a secretary. So when he got back, he and his wife made a stab at getting back together again, and it looked as though it was going to work out for a while. They lived in the countryside, quite near where his wife was brought up, in the sort of Newmarket area. And Aki was installed in a bedsit in London, which Blunden paid for, because obviously he was employing her as his literary secretary. So she went to the British Library pretty well every day, looking up various quotes and things for him that he needed while he was in the countryside. But Blunden's wife referred to Aki as his geisha girl, and she clearly was very suspicious of this strange relationship. And she eventually decided to go off with her other lover, and the two of them got divorced in 1931. And Blunden, of course, never married Aki. He was later to remarry twice, in fact. So Aki lived in London for the rest of her life. There was a bit of a crisis when Blunden became involved with his second wife, whom he married in 1933. She tried to get him to stand by that rather vague commitment that he had made, but she failed, and she eventually accepted her lot, and she wrote to Blunden, "I would rather be at your service starving than do any other work for any other people in any country." And that was more or less the situation, actually. I mean, there was one occasion when she got so behind on her rent in London that the bailiff had actually removed all of her furniture before Blunden eventually paid her enough money to stay there. She was in a bit of an embarrassing position from a Japanese point of view. Probably she didn't have the money anyway, but she never returned to Japan. And when Japanese visitors came to London, she tried to hide the location of her, rather little bedsit so that people wouldn't visit her at home. She eventually died in 1962. As I said, she was older than Blunden, so when she died, Blunden was actually a professor at Hong Kong University and had been in Hong Kong for some years. But she left all of her possessions to him. I mean, I suppose they probably all come from him in the first place, and so that was the end of Aki Hayashi. And there's actually a poem by Blunden which I rather think is about Aki Hayashi, so I'm going to read it, if I can just dig it out here. But she represented for him this very sort of self-sacrificing view he had of the Japanese. Yeah, so this is just a part of the poem, I think, but he puts, "I love to see those loving and beloved whom nature seems to have spited, unattractive, unnoticeable people, whose dry track no honey drop of praise or understanding, or bare acknowledgement that they existed, perhaps yet moistened. Still, they make their world." So I wonder if that was a reference to Aki. Anyway, Plumer, on the other hand, had much less trouble with his sex life. Of course, he was single, and he was also gay. There is a slightly strange story which is recounted by both Plumer in his own autobiography and by Lawrence van der Post. On the first evening when they arrived in Japan on this ship with Captain Mori, he treated them to a geisha party, at which they drank an awful lot of sake and were provided with one geisha each, and bedding was laid out for the three of them. And according to Lawrence van der Post, the geisha who was allocated to Plumer, tried everything she could think of to get him interested, but failed, which was a bit of a puzzle to Lawrence van der Post and to Maury. They don't seem to have worked Plumer out at that stage. Plumer himself gives a slightly different story, and we have to guess whether this was just camouflage, because of course when he wrote his autobiography and it came out, homosexuality was still illegal in the UK, and so he sort of hints at various things in both directions. But what he says about the geisha experience is that she was a very nice and obliging girl, and may be said to have literally laid herself out to please, nor was she unsuccessful. So I don't know if that's a hint at something, but he also says in his autobiography that at one point while he was in Japan, he contemplated marrying a Japanese girl. Whether this is true or not, I have no idea. He said he saw the complications that might arise. But instead, he seems to have had relationships with a number of his students. I've got a picture of him with his students here. So I'm afraid it's rather blurred, so you can't tell how old they are, but that's Plumer in the middle there. And he describes 4 of his students at different points as being dear to him, so I don't know whether that's some kind of euphemism. He lived for a while with a student called Sumida, and visited Sumida's parents in where they came from in the country. The parents after that quickly arranged a marriage for Sumida, and that was the last that Plumer saw of him, whereupon he lived with another pupil called Fukuzawa. And I think Japan's reputation as quite relaxed about these matters was one thing that attracted Plumer in the first place, because of course homosexuality was illegal in both the UK and South Africa. And Plumer actually argues that it was almost encouraged in Japan, particularly as it became more militaristic in the late 1920s when he was there. And he writes, "It was common to see 2 buck privates in uniform strolling about hand in hand with a faraway look in their eyes, and I was credibly informed that this was not an expression of ordinary matiness, but of an emotion to some extent encouraged in the armed forces, no doubt in the belief that greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his emperor, and that there will be an extra incentive if by so doing he is also laying down his life for his friend. Such intense relationships have of course a place in the samurai tradition." So Blunden and Plumer seem to have formed quite different impressions of Japan, even though they were there at much the same time. Blunden found things difficult at first, as I think most of us do when we first live in Japan, but he was adored by his students and of course his Japanese mistress. And he had the high status of a Tokyo University professor. So he came to love Japan, although of course he missed some things in the UK, obviously the countryside, cricket and English beer, notably. And later on, Blunden frequently expressed sympathy for Japan, even as Japan became more and more militaristic and more, as it were, an enemy in the 1930s. And he nearly got into trouble for that during the Second World War. Whereas Plumer had much more of a love-hate kind of approach to Japan. He made some close Japanese friends and lovers, as we've seen. He adored the Japanese aesthetic side, particularly theatre. He writes, "Japan almost took away my appetite for the English theatre. There, the art of acting, which is hereditary, has attained perfection." And I'll come back to that in a moment. So he loved Japanese theatre, he loved Japanese art, but he was clearer-eyed, I think, than Blunden in some respects. And my view is that one of the most interesting things about Plumer is he had incredibly good judgment. He was well ahead of his time in his critiques of both South Africa and Japan. So in Japan, he objected to the treatment of women and to the prevalence of suicide, which he described as annoyingly common. And he didn't like the emperor worship and the militarism that was growing, and he correctly predicted that it would lead to disaster. Now, Blunden, of course, was there to teach English literature, but Plumer was brought to Japan really in the hope that he would write about Japan and that he would write nice things about it. Shortly after he arrived, he was introduced to the foreign minister at the time, Shidehara Kijuro, who later became prime minister. And this man said to him that he would become the second Lafcadio Hearn, I'm sure most of you know who Lafcadio Hearn is, but he wrote a number of sort of quite romanticised descriptions of Japan and ended up adopting Japanese citizenship and living there. Anyway, Plumer rather bristled at this description. He said, "No, sir, I shall be the first William Plomer." So he didn't want to be the second Lafcadio Hearn. And indeed he wasn't. He wrote a book of short stories, all set in Japan, which came out in 1929, the year that he left the country. And it may have been part of the reason why he did leave the country. It's called Paper Houses, and it wasn't worth photographing the cover, but I've got a copy of it here. And it's got a very interesting introduction as well, in which he describes his views of Japan. And he attacks Lafcadio Hearn for what he describes as Japanegirics. But he lays out his opinions on the positives and the negatives of Japan. So on the positive side, he says things like, "They had already done all that art can ever do when the miraculous Nara sculptures were set up in the 8th century. I am an admirer of the Japanese, for I can respect and love individuals. But I disbelieve in their enslavement of women, and I detest their tendency to nationalistic paranoia and their particular politico-religious superstitions, which, if persisted in, will have terrible results," as indeed they did. And the stories in this book cover many of Plumer's concerns. There's a story about a schoolmaster who becomes obsessed by the portrait of the emperor, which all schools were required to install at that time. The portrait is actually stolen by a workman who has a grudge against the schoolmaster, whereupon the schoolmaster commits suicide. End of story. There's at least 2 stories in the book which focus on the poor treatment of Japanese women. And the final story, Mother Kamchatka, is a vicious sort of Swiftian satire in which Kamchatka is obviously Japan. And it's quite amusing, actually, this story, so I'll mention a few things. Kamchatka's reputation, quote, "rests chiefly on its exquisite gooseberry blossoms, of which there are such clouds everywhere that foreign visitors seldom see anything else. The country has been romanticised by an author who's called Cadwallo Turn, so I suppose that's Lafcadio Hearn. And the emperor, or Cham, of Kamchatka, is regarded as the father of God. The national flag was waving on the front of every house. It is an emblem whose design shows commendable simplicity. A poached egg, jewels, displayed on a white plate. People in this country are constantly committing suicide, generally out of sheer loyalty to the Cham. And the narrator describes a meeting of the new Social Democratic Party, which is immediately broken up by the police, and everybody is arrested and apparently executed. As the narrator sails out of Kamchatka, he notes that, and I'll quote this bit, "At the extreme end of the headland, at the ocean gate of the Champire, as it were, there stands the world-famous figure with its challenge of welcome, its loud but silent warning to the liberal. I mean, of course, the statue of discipline. The statue, as is well known, is in the shape of a colossal policeman." So that was kind of Plumer's view of Japan in the late 1920s. And perhaps it's just as well he left before that book came out. But having said that, I mean, in his autobiography, he does end the discussion of Japan on a pretty positive note. And he says, "Civilization has many dialects, but speaks one language. And its Japanese voice will always be present to my ear, like the pure and liquid notes of the bamboo flute in those tropical evenings on the Indian Ocean, when I heard it for the first time, speaking of things far more important than war, trade, and empires, of unworldliness, lucidity, and love." So anyway, Blunden left Japan in 1927, Plumer left in early 1929. Once they got back home, well, Blunden actually considered moving back to Japan again once his marriage broke down, but he didn't. And he spent most of the next 20 years as a fellow of Merton College, Oxford. One of the people he influenced there was the historian Richard Story. So Richard Story was actually one of his tutees, one of Blunden's tutees. And it was Blunden who recommended that Story should go to Japan. He took up a teaching job in Otaru in Hokkaido, just before the war, actually, in the late 30s. Well, Story went on to become historian of Japan and professor of Japanese studies at Oxford. For a while, actually, I used to supervise students in the Japanese department at Cambridge, and one of the things I had to supervise them on was sort of Japanese history. And so in that context, I had to introduce them to Story's book, his introductory book on Japanese history. And it was interesting that book starts and ends with a chapter which isn't really about history at all, but describes a Japanese family, a typical Japanese family at home. So I think what was going on here was that shortly after the war, Story was very keen to emphasise, just as Blunden always was, that the Japanese were perfectly normal people. You know, they weren't the kind of demons that they'd been described as during the Second World War. And presumably part of Blunden and Story's legacy at Merton College, Oxford, was that the current Japanese emperor chose that college to study at when he studied there in the mid-1980s. Actually, I've got a little slide of him studying there. Again, it's so grainy you can't really make it out, but that's Merton College, Oxford. I mentioned that Blunden's affection for Japan nearly got him into trouble, and there's another poem that might be worth just reading here in that context. So this was written in 1938 when Japan's rising militarism was becoming a real problem. It gives, I think, very clearly Blunden's view that the militarism was really an aberration. So it's called In the Margin. While few men praise, and hardly more defend, that armed power which from here, and as things are, appears the whole Japan, while this forced war, inhuman, drags to some inglorious end, and kills and fires and fouls, I too must feel horror and wonder at the deeds thus done, and fear each day's exploit of crashing steel has merely lost what old Japan had won. But through the smoke and dust I still can see, and may I not forget, much that belongs to that great name Japan, as well as those. Faultless devotions raise clear eyes to me. Through crowded streets grey-headed virtue goes, and from poor farms I hear peaceful old songs. So that was probably Aki again, the devotion. So he got into trouble during the war, but after the war, his attitudes made him the ideal person to rebuild the UK-Japan relationship. And so in 1946, he was invited to join the UK liaison mission, which is basically the embassy, but there wasn't an embassy because Japan wasn't independent yet after the war. He jumped at the opportunity, so he moved back to Japan and lived there for 2.5 years from 1947 to 1950 with his third wife and their child. And he was a huge success in this second period. Well, he was a big success in the first period too, but many of his former students were now extremely influential in Japan. They were leading lights in the literary and academic worlds, and they all told everybody, and their own students, that they had to go and hear Blunden's talks. He gave about 600 lectures in 2.5 years in Japan, and he often attracted enormous audiences. So at one of them in Osaka, for instance, he was in the city hall lecturing on the growth of English literature to 2,000 people. In Asahikawa, he had to lecture in the local Buddhist temple because it was the largest building in the city. And with consecutive interpretation, I mean, obviously Blunden didn't speak Japanese, these lectures would go on for about 2 hours. And it's very difficult to overstate the reverence with which Blunden was treated in this period. When he was lecturing at Jiyu Gakuen in Tokyo, he wrote on the blackboard Francis Bacon's phrase, "Abeunt studia in mores." That's Latin, and it means something like studies dissolve into real life. Apparently the blackboard on which he wrote that was left untouched for the next 20 years. I mean, for all I know, it's still there, but I did find this photograph of a blackboard at Jiyu Gakuen. The architecture is by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's a rather lovely building, but anyway, there's no sign of Blunden's writing on that, so maybe they rubbed it out in the end. Who knows? Anyway, the Foreign Office wanted to keep him in Japan as long as possible, but the Times, for whom he was working back in the UK, wanted him back. So he left in 1950, and the embassy thought, well, this is such a good thing. They hired another poet and critic called G.S. Fraser to do what Blunden had been doing. But G.S. Fraser found Blunden a really hard act to follow. And in 1951, about a year after he arrived there, he tried to kill himself by jumping out of a train on the way back from a lecture tour he'd been giving in Fukushima. So, I mean, he did survive, but he was kind of sent back to the UK. And what I found interesting about this was that 2 years later, the British opened the British Council in Japan in 1953. So in effect, I think what happened is that they decided that no single person could do what Blunden had done, and they put it on an institutional footing. And so when I became country director of the British Council in Japan in 2007, I kept coming across traces of Blunden everywhere I went. Notably, this is one of them. If you go to Ito City in Shizuoka Prefecture, this is a place where William Adams, the first British person to arrive in Japan, advised Tokugawa Ieyasu how to build Western-style ships, and he actually built some seagoing ships here in Ito. So they've set up a memorial stone, and I mean there's an image there which is supposed to be William Adams, but when he was invited down there for some ceremony, Blunden of course composed a poem. I won't read it to you because I don't think it's a particularly good one, but somebody from the British Embassy, and in this case me, had to go down there every year for ceremonies about William Adams and read out this poem. So Blunden was all over the place. So what about Plumer? Well, he later on became pretty influential, not so much as a writer, but as the chief reader for the publisher Jonathan Cape. So in effect, he was choosing what was going to be published, and he also did a lot of criticism and that kind of stuff. You'll recall that Plumer had been friends with Ian Fleming ever since Fleming wrote him a fan letter when he was at Eton. And Fleming actually hired Plumer to work with him at the Admiralty in the war. And Plumer's job, he was kind of an assistant on this, but they wrote an intelligence newsletter which was sent to Royal Navy ships all around the world during the war. So I imagine that the two of them working in the same department must have talked quite a lot about Japan. And then in 1952, the two of them were having lunch when Fleming persuaded, he was asking advice about some aspects of writing, and Plumer managed to worm out of him that he'd written a thriller. And Fleming was a bit coy about this, but he said, he gave it eventually to Plumer and said, "Do you think it's any good?" And Plumer said, "Yes, I think." So he got Jonathan Cape to publish it, and it of course was the first of the James Bond books, Casino Royale. So that's what the first edition looked like. That came out in 1953. Apparently Jonathan Cape himself hated thrillers and took some persuading to publish this book, but Plumer talked him into it, and of course it was a huge money spinner. Together with all of the other James Bond books, it made far more money than anything else Jonathan Cape ever did. Now, of course, one of the James Bond books is set in Japan, and we had Damien Flanagan speaking about James Bond and Japan at an event which you can find on the internet if you weren't here. And that's You Only Live Twice. Now, I'm sure many of you, probably most of you, have seen the film, You Only Live Twice. I doubt many of you have read the book. And I actually read it recently, and it's startlingly different from the film. I mean, basically the film is a completely different story, which was written by Roald Dahl, who wrote the screenplay for that film. The book, You Only Live Twice, was published in 1964, which was the year that Fleming died. And it's rather melancholy. It ends up with James Bond losing his memory completely. And he finishes up as an abalone fisherman, living on a small island with his love interest, who's called Kissy Suzuki. There's a sort of hint that he might get his memory back, but of course that was the last book that came out anyway. Now it's impossible to tell about Plumer's influence on this book. Obviously Fleming actually visited Japan for 2 weeks as research for writing this thriller. And of course he would have known a lot about Japan from his experiences in the war as well. But what is interesting in the book is, well, firstly on page 1 it references 2 different types of Japanese literature, including No, which was a particular love of Plumer and is mentioned in the 4th sentence. The other thing that's interesting about the book is that the baddie has bought a Japanese castle. He's not living in a volcano like the film. He's got a castle in Kyushu, and he's built a garden which is full of poisonous plants imported from all over the place. Not only poisonous plants, but there are fumaroles, like beppu, and there's also a lake with piranhas. And the reason Bond is asked to eliminate this chap is because the Japanese, with their love of suicide, are all flocking to this place to kill themselves. Why that's a problem is not really explained. So I wonder whether Plumer's influence is felt there. Anyway, Fleming was a heavy drinker and smoker like James Bond, and he actually died quite young at the age of 1956. And at his memorial service, it was Plumer who gave the address, which was actually published in a limited edition afterwards, so it is possible to buy copies. But even more than his influence on Fleming, I think Plumer's big contribution was perhaps his influence on the composer Benjamin Britten. Plumer worked as the librettist for Benjamin Britten on various operas, some of which saw the light and some of which didn't. So Plumer was the librettist, for instance, for Gloriana, which was the opera that Britten wrote to celebrate the coronation of the Queen in 1953. And Plumer was also the librettist for the three church parables, of which the first was Curlew River, which I'll talk about in a minute. Some of the operas that didn't make it, by the way, that they worked on together, there was one called The Tale of Mr. Todd, which is, of course, a Beatrix Potter story, but they couldn't get the rights to use the Beatrix Potter material, so they couldn't do the opera. There was also a very strange-looking opera, which was called Tycho the Vegan. Apparently Tycho hailed from the star Vega, which is in the constellation Lyra. It's nothing to do with his dietary requirements. So anyway, but the real influence of Plumer is that in 1955, Britten and his partner Piers, and the gay thing may also have been one of the connections they shared, but Britten and Piers went on an extended concert tour that took them to a number of countries, and they visited Japan in February 1956. So Britten asked Plumer, well, what shall I see when I'm in Japan? What do you recommend? And Plumer writes, I strongly recommended the Japanese theatre in its various forms, kabuki, bunraku, and no, particularly the no. I remember describing a no play and imitating some of the gestures used by the actors. The British Council, of course, were involved in setting up the concerts, which Britten and Piers did in Japan together, and they were requested by the two of them to set up a trip to a no play. So they went to see the no play Sumidagawa. And I'm sure most of you have seen a no play, but it's quite difficult to get the hang of at the beginning, and they found it rather comical to start with. But as they got used to it, I think Britten in particular was very impressed, and he asked to go back a second time and saw this play twice, actually. And he was only in Japan for about 10 days, but he saw Sumidagawa twice, and it clearly gave him some ideas. I was quite interested in this partly for personal reasons. So one of the personal reasons is that, along with the British Council, one of the people who organised this trip was called Keiichi Kurosawa. He was quite an important figure in introducing particularly early music to Japan after the war, well, and before the war. He founded the Tokyo Madrigal Group, in which I used to sing. I never actually met Keiichi Kurosawa, because he died in 1982, and I didn't live in Japan until 1983. But I was good friends with his son, who in fact was the tachiainin at my wedding, which is a kind of almost like a best man type of role at my wedding in Japan. My actual wedding was in the UK, but we had a party in Japan. In fact, Hiroshi, the son, was the driver for Britten and Piers on this trip. And when Britten and Piers got home, Britten sent his recorder to Keiichi Kurosawa as a gift to thank him for his help. And I've seen the recorder. It's got the initials BB sort of scratched onto it. I think you can see it, actually. It's in the museum of one of the music colleges now in Tokyo. Is it Musashi no Ondai or something? And actually Hiroshi, the son, died last year. So anyway, they went to this no play, and it ended up as this opera, Curlew River. It took quite a few years to come out, but Plumer wrote the libretto, and it's essentially exactly the same story as Sumidagawa, but it's turned into a medieval Christian play rather than the Buddhism that you find in the original. And the curlews in this are the capital birds, so in the Japanese they're miyakodori, capital birds, which so that the play refers to this poem, which actually comes from the Tales of Ise, about the capital birds. I can't remember the poem, but it's something like, this chap is told that these birds are called capital birds. Nobody actually knows what type of bird this is, but they are flying above the Sumida River in Tokyo, or Edo as it well, it probably didn't exist at all in those days. And this makes the poet long for his loved one in the capital, and he asks the capital bird, does my loved one still live? So Britain turned those birds into curlews, because the thing is set in East Anglia. And I guess the capital birds, you have the sort of mournful cry of the curlews, which is actually imitated in the music. And the music also picks up on certainly other aspects of Japan or of No. It's not really to do with No, but you can hear very clearly the notes of the sho, Japanese musical instrument. Again, I should have shown you a picture of a sho, but it's like a kind of metal panpipes. It's a rather traditional Japanese musical instrument, which is used in things like gagaku, the sort of very old-fashioned court music. And the reason why Benjamin Britten sent a recorder to Keiji Kurosawa is that Kurosawa had given him a sho, which they bought together in Kyoto. And when Britten gets on the plane, again, I should have shown you the photograph, but there's actually a photograph of Britten holding this sho as he gets on the plane at Haneda Airport, because he didn't want to put it in his luggage, obviously. And you can hear the sho in the organ part of this opera, note for note, really, because he also had some records that showed how it played. So anyway, Britten went on to write 2 more of these sort of Japanese-styled operas, but Curlew River is definitely the closest to Japan and also the most successful of them. And I might mention another reason for my personal interest in this is that when I was a boy, I think Edmund mentioned the reason I first went to Japan was that I was on a choir tour, and that was because I sang with King's College Choir, Cambridge. And when I was a boy singing in that choir, I was actually booked to sing a part in this opera. There's a very brief part at the end called The Spirit of the Boy. The spirit of the boy appears to the distraught mother. So he's dead, her son, but he appears very briefly. So I was the boy in that opera when I was little. As I say, it's a very brief part, and I spent most of the performance actually sitting under the stage reading the Beano, as I remember. I was quite little at that time. So I'm going to bring it to an end there. I hope it's been of some interest. I think I decided to put these 2 literary figures together because they did know each other and they were together. They had very different responses to Japan, but I think it shows how people who go to Japan at a formative age, like myself, can get kind of bitten by the bug and want to spread the good news. And of course that's what we're all about at the Daiwa Foundation. So I'm open to Q&A.